is that some nationalisms are kind of expansive efforts to dominate others. A lot of nationalisms, though, emerge out of founding traumas, okay? Founding traumas. Events, that reminds me, turn off my cell phone, right? Let me just do it. We should all do it right now, right, okay? So my wife doesn't call and say, how did it go? Right, okay. So you know, the thing about nationalism and these traumas is that it sort of creates the world view of people, right? And sometimes it's sort of deep, and it's not always clear in some ways how people see what's behind this, but it orients their vision of the project, of what they're doing, of the way they see the world. And anti-Semitism, a history of anti-Semitism, which I'll say more about, is the prejudice, bigotry, and racism against Jews that was largely in Europe and deep in European history, I'll say more, is largely the orienting framework of the Zionist movement. Okay? For Palestinians, anti-Semitism is almost like irrelevant, and their orientation to the conflict is through a lens and a trauma of colonialism. And colonialism is something that, you know, I think Americans sometimes we don't always have a clear view of. I don't think I really had a view of that until my first field work in Africa, where I started to learn about what the colonial project was and what happened. But for Palestinians, that's key. Okay, so I'm going to explain both of these things, anti-Semitism and colonialism, as traumas behind the nationalist movement. Okay, the first thing that I need to tell you, though, is that the world was not always divided into nation states, right? I called it a modern ideology, right? If we look at this part of the world, or the Eastern Mediterranean, we see that I wrote here 3,500 years or 3,500 years of multi-ethnic, I called them feudal empires, right? So what do I mean by a feudal empire? You've heard of European feudalism. Basically, most of the world was organized as feudal-type societies for like 10,000 years, most of the world. And what is that? It's kind of like a protection racket, okay? Most people in the world were peasants of some sign, falahin, they say in Arabic, farmers, engaged in some kind of, agriculture or animal husbandry. And then there was the guy in the local castle or something that would come around and demand taxes of a sort, some kind of a tribute, usually in the name of religion, but often through coercive force, because they had the knights, in the castle or something like that. You remember Robin Hood, right? Collecting taxes from the peasants and wanting to give it. Okay, that's feudalism. And empires were basically big protection rackets where they would extract taxes and it went all the way up to the top to Rome, right? Or to Egypt. And they would be at the top of this. But these were multi-ethnic empires. Rome didn't go change everybody to Roman. In fact, Roman citizens were at the top of it, and they had many different languages, peoples that they subjugated and extracted taxes from. And that's the way the world was. You look at Europe, right? The Russian Empire and such, there were many languages, and they all paid tribute to the center. Okay, so the world was not cut up into nation states. That was a modern thing that really starts in the 1800s for most of the world and spreads in the 1800s. The American Revolution and the idea of a republic was part of that history. I'm not going to get into political history in that regard, but to tell you that that's really its beginning of the idea of the republic, a public ruling the state. Okay? So it's really an 1800s phenomenon. I guess I'll also tell you that the top slides, you got, I don't know if you can read them, Egyptian empires, the Babylonian in the 6th century BCE, the Persian Empire. Those top ones are sort of, those are the empires that were around and that you could read about in terms of Israel-Palestine in what you might call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. Those stories take place with, Egyptian on the one, in early on, and Babylonian destruction, and Persian, books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay. The Greek Empire it really is sort of this in-between period in terms of the Bible, or the Hebrew Testament, the Bible and the New Testament. But the New Testament from the Roman period in the 1st century, you know that from biblical stories. And then when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, it becomes the Byzantine Empire, and Islam grew up in the 7th century and expanded, and then the Crusades came in my last slide, in the 12th century, set up an empire, a kingdom of Jerusalem for 200 years, and my next slide, and then the Ottoman Empire. I've left a little bit out. I've sort of done that very quickly. It's a lot of history, but we can't stay there for too long tonight, okay? If you have questions about that, I can go back to it. We're going to deal mostly with the modern. So if we went back 100 years, right, this is actually mid-1700s, but that's only because I'm looking at Poland and Lithuania, and it's yet to be partitioned by the Prussians and Russians. But Palestine, Israel-Palestine, was under the Ottomans from about 1500 or so. In the early 1500s, Suleiman the Magnificent took it over, and it was under the Ottomans for 400 years, 15, 16, 17, 1800s, okay? All that period was Ottoman, feudal system, collecting taxes from peasants to local nobles, who then went all the way up the line to the Sultan in Istanbul, okay? So now I'm moving from ancient history to what we call modern partition, right? These areas of the Ottoman Empire were divided after World War I by the victors of World War I. In this case, the French and the British. Now, the French and the British had been doing this for a while. I put down here in the corner a map of Africa, and it says Berlin Conference on Africa, 1885. So in 1885, the French and the British, along with King Leopold of Belgium and a few other nations, but it's largely the French and the British, sat down with Africa and went, you get this, we get this, you get this, we get this, you get this, we get this. And they created essentially the modern borders of Africa, many of them. The French and the British, what is that? So it's 15 to 30 years later, sat down before they were in this area of the Ottoman Empire. They were planning to go in, and they sat down and they made the map on the upper left-hand corner called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they said, you get this, we get this, and we'll administer these two territories in one way and these two territories in the other way. After the war, in the context of the new League of Nations, the French and the British divided these areas and gave it the borders that we basically see today. And they didn't call them colonies. They didn't make them into colonies. They made them in what were called mandates. And the idea was like, it was very similar to the white man's burden type of civilizing project. They said it was white supremacists. They said we're going to, they're not ready to rule themselves, to govern themselves, so we are going to educate them and civilize them until such time that they will become independent countries. That was the idea of the mandate, that Europeans should civilize these other parts of the world. So we could say a lot about the partitions. The French were in Syria and Lebanon, and the British, you can see color-coded, from Egypt through Palestine and Iraq. And of course, Iraq, they cut away Kuwait, and of course that was one of Saddam Hussein's big points 20 years ago now when he invaded Kuwait. He said it's always been Iraq. But of course, these borders also created a nation-state among people who were different. And we know today, you've heard, there are different people in Iraq and those lines are lines of conflict. So Kurds in the north, Sunni and Shia Muslims, it was borders drawn by the French and the British that created that state. We're not going to talk anymore about Iraq, maybe in questions if you have them, but we're going to talk about Palestine. And the original Palestine mandate, on the left, was divided yet again into two halves. And the British decided, early in this game, 1917, 1918, early 20s, that they were going to put two groups in charge of the two halves of the Palestine mandate that were their allies. Right? On the one hand, your right hand, Transjordan, meaning across the Jordan River, right? They put up the Hashemites in charge. And I wrote there Lawrence of Arabia and the Hashemites. And perhaps you've heard that name, Lawrence of Arabia, like it's a comic book character. But Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, was a real guy, a British officer, who was sent to Mecca to talk to the Hashemite family, who was the sheikh, the sharif of Mecca, right? And they ruled Mecca is the holiest